is an ambassadors forum, and thank you for turning out in such great numbers on a Friday afternoon. I think that's just yet another sign how important it is for us to engage with practitioners, leading practitioners of the world of international relations. We also like to thank Richard Presno and all the other sponsors who make this Ambassador Forum possible. It is truly appreciated by all our global studies students, Euro major students, international relations, economics students. And you can watch this and previous events on our YouTube channel at kresno.unc.edu. And it's a tremendous pleasure for me to welcome our distinguished speakers, former Austrian ambassadors Franz Cede and Ambassador Prosl, and also on the behalf of Klaus Ladders, who, as you have noticed, can't be here today, and it's not like he underwent a tremendous change of appearance. He is on a lecture tour in Australia and was also in Shanghai before that, but will be back very soon, next week, that is. And it's an honor for me to step in and moderate his ambassadors. And it's also, I think, an exception to have two ambassadors, former ambassadors with us. It's usually one at a time, so you seem to have to gang up to really confront this tough, questioning crowd that will be before you after your presentation. And our ambassadors have recently written a book, Ambition and Reality, Austria's Foreign Policy since 1945. So it is also in part a book tour you are on, and you have been to DC yesterday, you are on your way to New Orleans, and we are glad that you could have a stopover in Chapel Hill. We are looking forward to your talk and all the tough questions, thoughtful questions from our audience afterwards. Ambition and reality, that reminds me of expectation and reality gaps, which is of course a term to describe European foreign policy, high expectations and maybe not so high realities. Also, let me introduce the ambassadors first. They can speak frankly, so they are not the honest people who lie for their countries, as we know active ambassadors to be. But you are retired, as you just told me over lunch. The First Amendment applies. You can speak your mind as it is. You don't face any sanctions, and you don't speak for any government, though you have done that for your career. And it was Ambassador Franz Cede who studied law in Paris, Bologna, and Washington, and then was posted in Paris at Rabat, and then was the ambassador to Zaire, Congo, afterwards the general consul in Los Angeles, and then ambassador to Russia. And in Brussels, he was the Austrian ambassador to Belgium and NATO. So I guess you wore a double hat in that position. In Vienna, Ambassador Cede was assigned to the International Law Office of the Foreign Ministry. He was director of the International Law Office from 1993 to 1999, which I might add is the time after the end of the Cold War, and international law for especially countries like Austria underwent quite a flux. Ambassador Cede is the author and editor of numerous publications. He taught at the Diplomatic Academy in Vienna and the Andrassy University in Budapest, and is presently teaching at Webster University in Vienna. I know it from St. Louis, but apparently they have a franchise in Vienna. Our other very distinguished ambassador is Christian Prosl, and after completing his studies in law and French in Vienna, he studied at Geneva, the Graduate Institute there, and then worked for the UNDP in Burkina Faso in the 70s, and was later appointed head of Department for Western and Northern Europe, and acted as head of the Legal and Consular Section 1998 and 2002. And then he was the Austrian ambassador to Berlin, a city I know very well since I worked there for a long time, followed by the assignment to the United States. He was the Austrian ambassador to the United States until 2011. Later that year, he retired and can now speak freely, which we are looking forward to. Most Europeans and Germans in particular know Austria from skiing and hiking trips to the Alps. Americans also know it through The Sound of Music and maybe The Third Man if you're interested in Cold War movies. Some Americans tell me that they feel bad about knowing rather little of other countries, particularly small countries. Today, we are going to change that. But I always reassure them that people from large countries know less about smaller ones than the other way around. And I know, because I grew up in Germany very close to the border to the Netherlands. And the Dutch always knew what was going on in Germany, and I had no idea what was going on in the Netherlands. So it's a matter of size and distance and all that. Austria and Germany have a rather intertwined history, for better and for worse. And Austrian neutrality in the past and in the post-war era in particular was a bedrock of its foreign policy. How this has changed after the end of the Cold War, we will be interested to learn from you today. Its role was pivotal in the Balkans and in southeastern Europe, not only in the wake of the disintegrating Yugoslavia, but also in light of a very recent refugee crisis. And these are highlights, I believe, the audience and I are very interested in. We are also interested to learn about how to deal with right-wing populist movements and parties. And I know Austria has a much longer experience with that in the Cold War era than some other countries. The recent German election turned out to have a right-wing new party gain 13% in the parliamentary election. The Austrian election that's coming up on Sunday will see more than double that percentage for another right-wing populist party. And I think we are quite interested in how this is perceived and handled by the public, the wider public, the bureaucracy, and top diplomats. For all these reasons, we are excited to have two highly experienced Austrian diplomats with us today. And they asked me to present as a duet, a Mozart duet. So our choreography will be Ambassador Cede or Prosl, you sit on the left and right, I will sit in the middle and follow your ping-pong game, you know, when you pass the ball into each other's court. And then I will moderate the discussion of our most thoughtful and tough questions from the audience afterwards. It's my understanding you want to present your presentation first, and then we enter the discussion. I will moderate and collect questions, and then the ball will go from this court to that court.
Wonderful.
Please take a seat, and we move from there. Let me hold up your book for a second. Since you're on a book tour, that's the book. It is rather slim for the academic books. That's why also a wider audience can capture the main points of Austrian foreign policy since 1945. And I think you're going to elucidate us about the greater details and table of contents. Very well.
Thank you, Professor Moroff. It's a real pleasure to be here in Chapel Hill at this prestigious university. It is a particular pleasure to have been invited by you and Professor Lares to join you. We are on I would say, on a roadshow from Washington, Chapel Hill to New Orleans, where we will go tomorrow, to present our new book about Austrian foreign policy since 1945, and which is a good pretext to engage in a hopefully useful discussion with you about current issues of Austrian European foreign policy. Whatever comes to your mind, don't hesitate. We will be very happy to field your questions in as honest a way as possible. We have no restraints. We are no longer on the payroll of the Foreign Ministry. We can speak freely our mind. How did it come about? Why did we write this book? What was our motivation? When we both retired from active service in the Austrian Foreign Ministry, we got together as friends and met in a typically Viennese coffee house, the Greensteidl, at the center of Vienna. And we said to ourselves, let's do something. We cannot just solve Sudokus and sit in the park and read the yellow press. And I discovered that at that point in time, there was no book around on the shelves that would briefly describe and summarize Austria's foreign policy in an easily understandable, readable fashion, something you could recommend to your son. I have 2 children, and there was no book I would recommend them to read about Austrian foreign policy. And then my friend and colleague Christian and I, we decided to do it ourselves. We rolled up our sleeves and we went ahead. Christian Prosl, who was ambassador in Germany and the United States, obviously had the vocation to write the chapter on the US-Austrian relations and Austrian-German relations. I happened to serve in Russia, so my job it was to write something about Austria and Russia. I served in the international law department, so it was my job to deal with neutrality and with the state treaty and the rest of it. So you have in this book, I would say, a panorama of the major topics that make up the agenda of Austrian foreign policy since 1945. If you are interested, Dr. Google will help you. You surf into the internet and you will find it. You can even buy it on Amazon network. Anyway, I don't want to make too much propaganda for the book. I'd rather start and kick off our discussion with a very brief look back in the past, and then our division of labor is that Christian will then address the present and future and address those burning issues like German elections, Austrian elections, European Union, the future of the European Union, the Brexit, and you name it. And then hopefully we will have a very interesting discussion at this afternoon on Friday before the weekend starts for all of us. So rather than doing a monologue now and talk a lot about the history, I chose 4 milestones of Austrian post-war history, which I would like to describe for the sake of perhaps of information of the audience. As you well know, in 1945, Austria lay on the ground after the horrible Second World War. Austria lay in ruins. It was re-established as an independent country, but it was at the same time occupied by the 4 Allied powers, the Soviet Union, France, UK, and Britain. Vienna was divided into 4 occupation zones like Berlin. The eastern part of Austria was occupied by the Russians, so like an island, Vienna was sitting in the middle of the Russian Soviet zone. The western part of Austria was occupied by the Western Allies, but very much unlike Germany, Austria was able to maintain the unity of the country. In 1945, a government was established which had the authority over the whole of Austria. Elections were held in 1945, and very much to the anger of the Russians, the Communist Party turned out as losing these elections. Only 5% of the electorate voted for the communists, even though Vienna was occupied partly by the Soviets in the eastern part, by the Soviets, so they had a big influence on the elections. And this was an important date because it showed that in their large majorities, the Austrians opted for a Western-style democracy and didn't want to fall under the Soviet yoke. It took us, and this is the second milestone I wanted to describe, took us 10 years to become completely independent and to get the State Treaty in 1955. 10 years after the end of the war, only did we conclude a kind of peace treaty. It was not called peace treaty, but it's called State Treaty with the four Allied powers. At the same time, Austria opted for the international status of neutrality. And here I think it's quite interesting to know why did Austria choose this status of neutrality? How come that Austria voted or became a neutral state? To understand this question, I think it's interesting to recall post-war history. Germany was the main focus of Soviet policy in Europe. Austria was in a kind of secondary concern for the Russians. They decided that they would not conclude an Austrian state treaty before what they called the German question would be settled. After 1953, Stalin died in 1953, and a more liberal policy started to develop in Moscow. At the same time, German Chancellor Adenauer opted for a close cooperation with the Western allies, with the United States of America in the first place as far as security policy is concerned. And early in 1955, Germany became a member of NATO. At that time, the Russians discovered that it didn't make any sense for them any longer to maintain this linkage between the Austrian question on the one hand and the German question on the other. They decoupled the German question from the Austrian questions, knowing well that they couldn't get the whole of Austria in view of the presence of the French, Americans, Brits in the western part of Austria. Neutrality seemed a compromise for all sides to allow Austria to become fully independent again as a sovereign country, and at the same time for the Russians, their main concern was to prevent that Austria would join NATO. This was a no-go for the Russians. They would never have allowed us at that time to join the Western military alliance. So in a kind, this was a compromise formula that served us well, and Austria developed after 1955 in the context of the Cold War as a very successful neutral country, portraying herself as a bridge between the East and the West, and taking a proactive part in multilateral diplomacy. We joined the United Nations in 1955, even the year of the State Treaty, unlike Switzerland that became a member of the United Nations only in 2002. So almost half a century later. What else made the trademark of Austrian foreign policy in this Cold War period? One of the very prominent leaders of Austria was Bruno Kreisky, foreign minister, chancellor, who was a defender of détente policy, a good friend of Willy Brandt in Berlin. He promoted also what is called Ostpolitik in Germany, and was very much in favor of this process of cooperation in Europe, which ended up in the Helsinki process of the OSCE, as it is now called. Formerly it was the Conference on Security and Cooperation of Europe. Perhaps you know that in 1975 the Helsinki Act was concluded, and this was really a big step forward in the direction of détente. Now Vienna is the headquarters of the OSCE. Vienna is also the headquarters of important international organizations, International Atomic Energy Agency. We are one of the major UN headquarters in general. After New York, Geneva, it is Vienna. Then we have very interesting other organizations like OPEC, you name it. And I would say these organizations, the fact that they came to Vienna was in a way a benefit of our policy of neutrality after 1955. And now I come to the last milestone, which I really would very briefly like to describe. After the big changes in Europe, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, German reunification, the collapse of Yugoslavia, and the division of Czechoslovakia, which are now two countries, Austria all of a sudden was facing a completely new international environment. Neutrality, as we learned it at school, no longer served the same purpose. Austria was no longer a bridge between East and West in the sense of being at the borderline between communist Eastern Europe and Western Europe, but now after 95 we became a member of the European Union, and we are right sitting in the middle of Europe, in the middle of the European Union. It's even more true so after 2004, when in a big bang admission process 10 Eastern European and Southern European countries all of a sudden were admitted to the European Union, and some of them also to NATO. So we are now in a completely new international environment, and this is perhaps the moment to hand over the floor to Christian, who will share with you his thoughts on the present of Austria's international situation at the heart of Europe.
Thank you very much. You will ask yourself, why did Austria join the European Union? First, for economic reasons. Second, for political reasons, of course. What is the European Union? The European Union is a peace project. We have learned in Europe after 2 world wars that it makes no sense to kill each other, to destroy each other's countries, but we have to work together. And with all the faults and all the restraints of the European Union, this objective has been achieved. So it is a successful project. The only war that took place in Europe after World War II was the war in the Balkans, outside the European Union. And I have to say that without the help of the United States, this war would not have been finished late, but still finished, and peace came back to that region. Because at that time, the European Union was unable to have this military decision-making power and also military force to end the war. So together with the Americans, we finished that war, and this had a clear influence also on Austria. So what was the interest of the European Union to have Austria on board? First, the idea was the European Union should grow to encompass the whole of Europe. When the European Union started in '56, there were 6 countries, then there were 12 countries, 9 countries, 12, 15, 18, now we are at 28 countries. But of course, there's still an area between the eastern border of the European Union and the Russian Empire, where you have countries, they do not belong to the European Union, like Belarus, the Ukraine, Moldavia, and some countries in the Balkans. The advantage that the Austrians brought to the European Union was, of course, one major advantage is our knowledge on the Balkans. You might remember that World War I started in 1914 with the assassination of the heir to the throne, of the Austrian heir to the throne in Sarajevo, Bosnia-Herzegovina. And that this area was a contested area, the whole Balkans, between basically the Austrian Empire and the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. From that period, we still have very good relationship with other countries in the Balkans, and we think that we have also a rather good knowledge of it. In addition to that, because we have that knowledge, we always think and we support the countries on the Balkans to join the European Union. We were among the first to recognize Slovenia and Croatia after the war on the Balkans. It was in the 90s. And we always said that we wanted them to join the European Union, which they achieved 2004 or 2009. So we feel a kind of responsibility for these countries that resulted from the breakup of former Yugoslavia. Former Yugoslavia is now, the territory of former Yugoslavia is now encompassing 7 countries, small as they are, and the question is, what do we do with those? We have to bring them up to the European standards, and we are supporting all the forces in these countries who are aiming at the same goal. The war on the Balkans had a direct influence on Austria. We had, for instance, an influx of refugees from Bosnia in the order of about 90,000 people. And if you think that this is about 1%, a bit more than 1% of our population, imagine the United States has to take in, within a period of 2 or 3 years, 3.5 million people. So then you see the ordre de grandeur that this encompassed to us. But I have to say, at that time, immigration and the influx of refugees was not a problem in Austria. We were always very helpful, in particular when the Hungarian uprising took place. Some of you might remember in 1956, about 200,000 Hungarians came to Austria. From there, they were then dispatched to other countries, United States, Canada, and so on. But they were well received and received with open arms by the Austrians, because these were our brothers-in-law, as we called them, and they called us during the monarchy. So, of course, we tried to help them. Then we took over about 50,000 Poles in the Polish crisis, 100,000 Czechs in the Czech crisis, and this 90,000. So we were a country that was open for the neighbors in need. By the way, we have an organization called Neighbors in Need, where the Austrians give a lot of money to help certain projects. This has changed in the year 2015. And then I'm going really back in coming to the present. In the year 2015, in 1 year, about 1 million refugees or economic immigrants, and that is the point, we do not know were they really refugees, meaning under threat of being killed, or were they coming because they saw that in Europe life is better, and maybe they thought also life is better without having too much to work, which is not true, of course. So about 1 million crossed the border from Austria, came to Germany, coming from countries like Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq mostly, then also some from the northern African countries. And about 90,000 came to Austria and stayed in Austria in 1 year. So that I made already the comparison before when we took the Bosnians, but this was over a period of 2 or 3 years. But now it was in 1 year. The worst was that we had the impression that our governments in Germany as well as in Austria lost control over who entered the country. The masses were such that there was no possibility of controlling them. And of course there was the fear that there might be some terrorists. Actually there were some terrorists, as we know now. And this changed enormously the mood of the population. At the beginning, we had this welcoming culture. A lot of individuals came down to the border, helping them, the Red Cross, of course, the Caritas, and so on, all these organizations. But now, slowly, the whole mood changed in Austria as well as in Germany. What is the result of this? I'm now jumping a bit because I think this is a direct link to the results of the German elections, and it will be also a direct will have a direct impact on the Austrian elections that will take place next Sunday. If you look at the German elections, you see that the CDU, the Conservative Party, the last 5 to 10 years under Mrs. Merkel moved to the left. And with her policy of open borders, people found threatened, in particular those who were the losers of globalization. And this was kind of overlooked. It's some kind the same effect like you have with the election of President Trump in the United States. Some major parts of the population felt overlooked, and in Germany, you had the rise, the enormous rise of the AfD, which got from 0 to 13%. And the question is now what will happen in Austria. By the way, in Germany, the conservatives lost about 7 or 8%, and the Social Democrats, the partners, the former partners of the conservatives in the coalition government, lost 10%. So you can say that in Germany, the center was weakened, but on the right there was a new party. In Austria, the politicians have studied the German thing, and what had happened is that the center, instead of having moved left, moved towards the right. Another question is, will we have a government that is dominated by the conservatives and the Social Democrats, the coalition that we had before? This is rather improbable because we had such a large part of dirty campaigning in the last 3 weeks, so that I do not think that the conservatives and the Social Democrats can build a coalition anymore. So now comes the question, what will do the right party? We have the right-wing populist party, the so-called Freedom Party, and they have about, in the polls, 25%. The Social Democrats have about 25 or 27%, and the conservatives is about 33, 31, 33%. So the big question will be less the election, of course, this is the basis for the coalition afterwards, but who will make a coalition with whom? The Social Democrats, who until 6 months ago said they will never make a coalition with the Freedom Party, are thinking that over. And the question is, who will be the kingmaker in the Austrian election? Because we will probably have 3 parties more or less equal, one in the lead and 2 others following, and who will make a coalition with the other. So it will be a very interesting development. You will wonder why we have this right-wing populist party. I think there are right-wing elements in the party, but for the most of it, it is a protest party, people who are not happy with the government, people who have been felt alone, and the application left and right does not really fit, because it can be left on one subject, right on the other subject. But one thing is for sure, they are very strict and clear about controlling immigration that plays somehow in the present mood in the population. We think, however, that immigration is one part, but what is even more important is integration. I was Consul General in Los Angeles, and I met a lot of former Jewish Austrians who had fled the country and who came to the United States. And they told me, look, the first thing what we did is, when we arrived, we went to a school at night to learn the language, and then we tried to find work. That's how it was in the late 30s, early 40s, 50s. And this is I think this is the right way to integrate a new minority into a country. We had never had problems with our neighbors, also for a reason because basically it is the same culture, but now we have people coming from a totally different culture. They are mostly Muslims, they have a different attitude, you have revenge as one of the themes, and you do not have this Christian or the Judeo-Christian idea of atonement or forgiveness and so on and so forth. So it's a totally different set of mind, and we have to tell them what we expect from them. At the same time, we have to be open for them. So this will be a lot of work ahead, the next 10 to 20 years certainly, probably over 2 generations. These are the problems that we are facing on a local level, Austria and Germany. But this is not only a national problem for the Austrians and the Germans, it's a general European problem. And here we come back to the idea of Europe. Europe was the European Union. The idea was burden sharing, but we have the same basic values. We trust each other, that is, we are all democracies, maybe slightly different, but still we trust each other, and in the Council of Ministers we can speak openly and so on and so forth. What we overlooked in that is that the Eastern relatively new members of the European Union, I'm speaking about the Baltic states, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, they have a different history than Western Europe. They have been for over 40 years under the communist yoke. They do not want some orders from Moscow, they never like that, and they do not want to be told by Brussels or the Western Europeans what to do. It is true that they are democratic in a certain way, and certainly we can say they are democratic, but I have the impression what is still missing is that democracy is not only about elections. Democracy is also about treating the former political opponent fairly, treating minorities fairly, accepting the change of power after an election and so on and so forth. It is not only about winning elections, maybe with dirty campaigning or whatever, you know. And I think here we have to understand, and they have to learn that, and we have to treat them with more respect. We in Austria, we know this probably better than our friends in Portugal and Spain who are far away. I mean, they are thousands of kilometers away, but we know them from the history, and they are neighbors, so we know that. So the problem that we are facing now is that on the Council of Ministers, they decide, well, everybody has to take a quota of refugees, and the Poles and the Hungarians say, not with us. So I personally think there must be another way of having them, bringing them together to help these refugees, even if they are not yet ready to take them. Because you should not forget, I mean, France and Britain and Spain and Portugal, they had colonies, and they are used to having people from the colonies in the capital, the metropoles now. I mean, you go to France, you have 5 or 6 millions from North Africa. In Britain, you have the Pakistanis, the Indians, or the people from that area. But the Poles never had colonies. The Hungarians, even less. So for them, this is a totally new way. They have to be get used. These are people from a different culture. We have to treat them with respect. We have to accept their culture, and so on and so forth. I personally think it takes time also for them, and we have to give them a certain time, and in particular, we have to talk to them. We have to make seminars, we have to teach them in a way that they do not feel taught as a professor, but as a friend. Look, we did it this way or that way. So immigration definitely is one of the major problems that the European Union faces. Another problem that we have is, of course, the question of the euro crisis. I don't know how many of you are economics or are interested in financial affairs. I just want to mention shortly that this crisis, of course, as you all know, started in the United States with the subprime crisis, then switched over to Europe, where then the governments paid for the banks who were breaking down. With that, they increased the public debt. And then we had the European Central Bank, who put a lot of money, like in the United States and in Britain, into the economy, so that the euro would be saved and that the economy is picking up again. I can report to you that personally I think maybe the crisis is not totally solved, but we are on the best way. The stock market in the United States is going up, but also in Germany and in the European countries. So it seems that the worst is over, although it cost quite a lot of money. And one should not forget that the policy of cheap money that is pursued by the European Central Bank is to the disadvantage of the German people, the Germans who do not invest in shares on the stock exchange, but put their money on the bank, where they get 0.2 or 0.7, maybe when they're lucky, % interests, and that at the same time keeps the general level of interest down, meaning that the southern countries of the European Union pay less interest for their debts, meaning they are less induced to make the necessary reforms. That's the basic line. Many countries, in particular the southern part, have to undergo some major reforms, and the cheaper it is, the cheaper the money is, the less there is the inclination to undertake these reforms. One person who tries hard is, of course, Monsieur Macron in France, and we will see how far he will be able to go. But I think the direction is right. Another thing, what is important and what is bothering us in the European Union is, of course, the idea that we have 28 countries, but not all participate in a free area of movement of capital, persons and goods. Not all of them. We call it the Schengen area. Not all of them have the same, accept the whole social policy of the European Union. Not all of them, another group has 17 countries have the euro, but not all of them. So it is a kind of a patchwork. If you are a student of history, you might find out that in the Holy Roman Empire, this was such a different, all the different princedoms and kingdoms had different methods and different kind of constitutions. So it was also a patchwork. And here we are again. Europe is an agglomeration of independent countries, and the European Union tries to make something united of that group of people. But of course, it's a question of identity. We have still our national identity before our European identity. I don't know, in America, I think you are first Americans and then from the North Carolinas or from New York, but still first Americans. In Europe, it's different. You are first Austrian, and if you are a Tyrolean like Franz, you are first Tyrolean, then you are Austrian, and then you are European. But at least he is European, you know, that's already an advantage, even with the Tyroleans. Anyway, so we have the problem that we have to promote the European identity, which is a very long-term project, but it's necessary, of course, as we know. Okay, I think I do not want to bother you more. I think basically I have mentioned the different areas. Just one final thought. I do not like to talk so much about the different crises. As I mentioned, I used that word too because you read about that in the newspapers, but basically the European Union is work in progress. And crisis means there are some problems, but so far we always have overcome the problems. So we can be rather optimistic with some goodwill and with good political leadership. We will certainly overcome the next problems that might arise or will arise. And I even would prefer to call them the challenges, because it's a positive word. And I'm sure we will meet these challenges in the next years to come. Thank you.
We have been witnessing the resurgence of a new political identity in Eastern Europe. And you were very close to the former Yugoslavia, and you saw it firsthand. In Germany also had over 1 million refugees from that civil war. And we thought this would never happen to us. And that's something that's in the wake of a failed political system, of a failed identity. Workers of the world unite, very cosmopolitan. Of course, in theory, no ethnicity and nationalism played any role, right? Even, right? This is the slogan of during World War I, you know, workers of the world unite, don't fight each other on nationalistic, ethnic basis. And now we witness that this kind of ethno-national identity politics has spread to the West. Whether it has spread from the East or anywhere else. It would be my question. Have we lost the old left-right difference between political parties? The old kind of political identities? And has it been supplanted in good part by a new kind of populism, identity, ethnic politics? And I'm asking this to you because you had the Freedom Party around since the 1990s, since the end of the Cold War. It seems like once the enemy was gone, in this case communism, what's the new identification kernel we can galvanize voters and the electorate around? And since the end of the Cold War, you have these movements gaining ground in former multi-ethnic countries. The Netherlands, of course France for a longer time, Denmark, Norway, the United States with the most recent election. Do you see a parallel there? Are we looking for new kind of political identities that defy left and right, that even defy what the Green Party stand for, post-materialism, materialism? And if so, was this a harbinger, what we have been seeing in Yugoslavia and in the former communist Eastern Europe, for something that we might face? Of course, in a different way. History never repeats itself, right? But it rhymes and it bounces then in different ways. I think this is the big question I have for you as Austrians. And you have been very close to that screen, and maybe you just see the dots, but if you step back, maybe there's a bigger picture. And this is something I'm interested in, maybe the American audience is interested in. Have we entered a new political arena? On top of that, of course, Austrian politics has been a muck-breaking and scandalizing kind of politics. I watched the political debates. It was full of ads and negative campaigns. You might know in the United States, but unknown in most of continental Europe, and certainly to Germans. It was very interesting to watch that politics seems to have been now become a business of scandal and counter-scandal, and populist parties perform the politics of rage management, right? Almost like in the old Roman arena. You talked about the classics, that people are watching the gladiators, the political gladiators, essentially character assassinate each other, right? So, I know it's a big picture question, but maybe we start with that and then open.
Perhaps I start trying to give an answer and you maybe to the work, okay? In addition to the ethno-nationalism you mentioned, and I share your analysis, I observe a sub-national ethno-nationalism. If you think about Catalonia, if you think about the Scottish referendum situation in other countries where there are strong minority, so they are shaping sub-national, I would say regional national identities. Another element which may be a destabilizing factor of fragmentation of the European Union. What could you do about that? I think that one of the problems, and I don't have the wonderful solution, but I can observe that the European Union also has an identity problem in the sense that nobody knows in which direction this project of the European Union finally goes. The problem of finality. Will it be a kind of United States of Europe? Will it be a federation of national states along the de Gaulle model, l'Europe des patries? There is no clear-cut vision about the future of Europe. So it's very hard for people to identify with the bureaucracy in Brussels or with the institutions of the European Union. I see a real challenge for the European Union to come up with a new goal, a new perspective of the future. If you talk to young people, and I was at the Andrássy University in Hungary, they didn't feel like Europeans at all. They were happy that Hungary was a member of the European Union, NATO. So in the sense that they won the Cold War and got rid of the Soviet domination. But there is still, in the first place, a Hungarian identity, a Hungarian loyalty, not a European, let's say, common identity which you will find in the streets in Budapest, and I think the same is true for other European countries. So it's rather an analysis as a good answer on how to counteract.
Can I add something? I think in times of war, you have an objective to free your country of the aggressor. In times of peace, we have to ask us, what are the objectives of our lives? And I think with the wealth that comes with the peacetime, people do not want to ask them that question. They do not have a clear vision of their own lives. How can they have a clear vision of Europe, of a political project, if they don't even know what they are wanting? For me, this is a question, it's much more a philosophical or even a theological question. We are well off in Europe. I mean, you know, social welfare is here. You see people retired like the two of us. We can travel the world. We can tell everything what we want. Everything is fine. But what is the purpose of life? And I think we should go much more into the detail, to the depth of our conscience or of psychological psyche to get a new sense of the life. There was a famous Austrian psychologist, In Search of Meaning, who was in a concentration camp, who survived the concentration camp and said, in a concentration camp, I was thinking about it. Why did people want to survive, and now in the freedom people commit suicide and so on and so forth? Viktor Frankl, right, thank you. So I think this is the basic thing. We should become more philosophical, less materialistic, but we are in some tendency of post-materialism is here. The green movement, for instance, they say, okay, we have to save the world. That was a clear objective. And they have quite good things. But for the rest of the population who is not that interested, it is very difficult. And in the political arena, man, the question is, how come that the Brexit was popular after all? I mean, they got a majority, the Brexit people. How come? Was it so really so bad? Or was it because they said Brussels is bad? I mean, we have to think about much more in a philosophical way. That's my opinion.
Okay, we started from collective identity politics and ended up with the identity of individuals, right? In the city of Sigmund Freud and others, and Paul Watzlawick and so forth. This is a lecture series on the history department, because I'm of critical science, but I will honor that tradition to ask the historical question. And I want to tap into Austrian or Austro-Hungarian Empire history on this. Metternich was known for rejecting any kind of ethnically based collective identities, right? The Congress of Vienna, after the Napoleonic Wars, was very afraid of this democratic and nationalist movements that went hand in hand. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a multi-ethnic territorial empire. So was the Ottoman Empire, so was the Russian Empire. Those were large multi-ethnic territorial empires whose identity could not have been based on one single national ethnic identity kernel. You as Austrians who studied the history, seeped in that history, is there anything to learn from those multi-ethnic empires? Of course, they have become defunct in 1918 and the right of self-determination took over. But what is it that we might be able to learn from the multi-ethnic empires that Austro-Hungary was one of till 1918?
I think you need in each country, you need a common something or a person who unites everybody. It was clear that in the Austro-Hungarian Empire this was the emperor. It is also clear in Britain that it is the queen. Let's put it that way. If you don't have that, then you have to find something else. In the United States, you have the Constitution. And it seems to me we have not yet found really, but the point is people even are questioning about the Judeo-Christian civilization that impacted Europe. I think that it had a major role. I mean, in 12th, 13th, 15th, up to the 19th century, it was a major role. But now people are saying it was not necessary. And only one thing, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was working quite well, better than its reputation was, and now, interesting enough, historians are coming back and finding out the relative positive things. But the big mistake was when they started to introduce different language, the Badeni laws, when everybody had the right to speak not only at home, but had also the right to have his school, the universities, Prague, suddenly you had a German university, the Czech university. This was splitting the people apart. And I think it was better before, because everybody in Bohemia, for instance, they spoke German, they spoke Czech, and in Vienna they spoke at least 3 languages, and in Italy the same. So that was much more, and language is one of the major elements of identity. So if you put an emphasis on language, then you have a reason to be an enemy of one who does not talk your language. It is important for your entity, but you have to learn 2 or 3 languages to relativize your own identity and say, okay, I am speaking German, but my brother or my friend is speaking Hungarian or Czech, and we are still human beings, we still have a common idea. And it seems to me that the common idea of Europe alone is not enough. We have to have something going beyond that. Maybe we'll find it. Social welfare is not enough. The material wealth is not enough to bring people together. When you have a project, you have an idea, and that idea brings people together because you want to succeed your project. So we have to find a project.
We are in the process of going on the deep end here, right? With many philosophical questions, but I think they're very exciting. Let's open up to the audience, and I'm instructed to tell the audience you should wait till the microphone has arrived at your place before you start speaking. Otherwise, we don't get the recording. So please raise your hands. I think, yes, the gentleman over there.
And I'll be quick. I appreciated what you said about language and about the need for immigrants that come in need the language. And yet there's another aspect that is probably even more important. If you look at Japan, the population of Japan is actually decreasing. The populations in the United States are actually no longer increasing in size. They are also decreasing in size. It seems to me that the same is true in Europe. And yet, so we don't see people recognizing immigration as an opportunity. And I'm asking for comments.
I can just give you an answer. You're absolutely right. I totally agree with you. But that means we need the people coming, but they have to accept the way of life, and we have to accept their individuality and their views. I think this is quite well has worked out quite well in the United States, because you have one continent and you have basically one civilization. In Europe, with our different wars, everybody thinks about, the Austrians think even now until of 1866, where the Germans beat us and so on and so forth. You talk to Austrians. So this is the crazy thing of history, by the way. Well, excuse me, Professor, but you are right. We have to see that as a chance. But immigration is easier when you have the same civilization, of course. So now we have the challenge. We have a Muslim immigration, for instance, in Germany and in Austria. We didn't have that many Muslims. How do we integrate those? And that will be the challenge, and that will be also the test for us.
So I think yes.
Hello. Are you able to hear me?
Yep.
Good. Well, you touched briefly on Austrian Ostpolitik. I know Willy Brandt made it his legacy to bring about Ostpolitik when he was Chancellor of West Germany. Was there a leader of Austria with a similar story of promoting Ostpolitik? If so, could you tell us a little about it?
I didn't understand the last part of this.
If so, if there is a story of a leader of Austria promoting Ostpolitik, could you tell us a little about it?
Well, as I mentioned before, our former Chancellor Bruno Kreisky was very much in favor. He was a champion of détente, of Ostpolitik, relaxation of tensions between the East and the West. And the OSCE, the Organization on Security and Cooperation in Europe, was a scheme to promote this détente in Europe, bringing together, in spite of the ideological differences, capitalism on the one side, communism on the other, bringing together ideas, people, strong focus on human rights, economic cooperation, political cooperation, and you name it. And this process of dialogue, this platform of negotiations, which started really in the early 70s and had its climax in 75 with the signature of the final act of Helsinki, was promoted by, I think, by Austria, by Germany in the first place. For Germany, also this was also a way to overcome the split between GDR and the Western Germany, Federal Republic. But in a larger context, you could also say was a way to overcome the divide between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. And in some ways, and here I'm speaking as a former international lawyer, it's very interesting to notice that even though the OSCE and the final act of Helsinki was not a treaty ratified by parliaments, it was not an international agreement under international law, but it was rather a political process, a political document which was based on the trust that the leaders involved would deliver. And I think it's fair to say also that this process led to, perhaps in the end, to the dissolution of the communist regimes. It was the beginning of the dissident movements in the East, because they could point to the letter of the final act and where all the principles of human rights were enshrined, expression, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, etc. And this certainly contributed to, let's say, the disintegration, the ideological disintegration of the communist regimes. Do you agree?
Yeah, I just want to add two concrete things. What was very helpful was that Austrian TV could be watched in Hungary and in the Czech Republic. They saw how democracy works, they saw how we lived and so on. This was certainly something objectively, and we measured that, and for them this was a window to the West. The second is, Franz mentioned the dissidents. In Austria, very soon, the political parties, in particular the conservatives, by the way, tried to establish a relationship with the dissidents in the Czech Republic, in Poland, Solidarność, but also in Hungary, because here your history comes into play again. We knew these people, we knew how they were ticking, so to speak, and so it was relatively easy. And at that time, it was possible, and we sent them copying machines, we had them to establish parties and so on and so forth. What we had experienced. This was, we are a relatively, I mean, we're a middle-sized country, not very much, but it had an impact, and these people needed the support from the West, because they were, otherwise they would have been left alone in their own country.
Well, thank you. Oh, you were going to say?
Just want to fill in the last gap. The Soviet Union and Brezhnev wanted to have the post-war borders recognized, which is why they agreed to the Helsinki process. And of course, the dissidents themselves named themselves after the Carter 77. We could say it's a rhetorical action trap. Right? They promised all the freedom of expression, and it came home to roost later on when it was opened with Glasnost and Perestroika a little later. So that's the other side of that Helsinki process. But yeah.
Please, well, thank you.
I want to thank the ambassadors for interesting observations, both historical and contemporary. I think you did a nice job of overviewing both Austrian history, as I understand it, and contemporary EU problems. But you have left out the elephant in the room, as we Americans say. You didn't discuss Russia at all, the Russian role in contemporary European politics, both energy dependence on the economic side and political alternatives to democracy, its relationship with particularly Prime Minister Orban and promotion of alternative conceptions of illiberalism, if you will, not to mention what we Americans have been bombarded with in terms of meddling in the 2016 election, which is a probably not a very important European issue, but it's clearly an important American issue. So, care to comment on the role of the Great Bear on the East?
Let me try to deal with the elephant in the room. I was ambassador in Russia for 4 years, from 1999 to 2003. This was the period of transition from Yeltsin to Putin. So I could observe the rise of Putin, who was a complete nobody before. What I learned while I was in Russia, Russia was in a very bad shape during Yeltsin. And there was a sense of lost empire. The attitude was that the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and Putin used this expression, was the biggest catastrophe of the 20th century. There was a kind of feeling that the collapse of communism and the collapse of the Soviet Union was a dramatic development, and that it should be reversed. And Putin was coming to power with the ambition to re-establish Russia as a big power, to re-establish Russia as a proud participant of the international family of nations at the same playing field with the United States. In fact, in some way, in a very destructive way, he succeeded. You cannot ignore Russia anymore. If you look at Syria, if you look at the Ukraine and other places of conflicts in the world. I'm very critical about the Putin regime. I always was. And I find it really very disturbing what Russia does in the Ukraine. the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula certainly was a flagrant violation of international law. This referendum was a scam. The destabilization of the eastern part of the Ukraine is certainly goes to the is the responsibility of Moscow, and the non-observance of the Minsk agreements. Everybody knows who is behind that, but the West is, I would say, in a very weak position to counteract. Within the European Union, you have countries which, for obvious economic trade relations, are not happy with the sanctions which were imposed by the European Union against Russia. At the same time, some countries like Portugal or Spain, who are far away, are not in the same fashion concerned about what's going on in this part of the world compared to Poland, the Baltic states, or and Ukraine. So there is not a cohesive single European policy, credible policy towards Russia. And Mr. Putin is very cleverly playing out one country against the other. At the same time, the President of the United States also has a Russia problem with some claims that there was meddling of the Kremlin in the US presidential elections. Now you have sanctions imposed, US sanctions imposed against Russia, which are even harsher than the European sanctions. And here again, the Europeans, for obvious economic interests, are not happy with these US sanctions against Russians. And Putin, he can smile in the Kremlin if he looks at these different positions of Western countries, and also the behavior of the Western countries in Syria, the conduct of the fight against the ISIS is not uniform. You have quite different conduct vis-à-vis the region in Syria. So I think this is a Pandora's box which you open with your question. I just pointed to the problem involved.
May I sharpen this to something very concrete? Because the Russians have helped the Front National in France with massive amounts of money, and that's well documented. There are other ways to support parties who are very skeptical about European integration and multiculturalism. So I'm sure they have supported others in different ways. There are links to the German AfD. This is the right-wing party that won 13% 2 weeks ago. So my concrete question is, has there been evidence that Russians are supporting certain parties that are anti-multiculturalism and anti-European integration in Austria?
Not so far. We don't know yet. I have not read any report on that. But one thing is for sure: there's a very active Russian so-called friendship group active in Vienna, and they are promoting the Russian ideas. That's obvious. And with that, this comes to the journalists, comes slowly into the population. But we have not yet found direct involvement. That we have not yet found. Another problem that you mentioned, and that is very important, is of course the energy supply. You are absolutely right. Energy supply, I remember when we started the presidency in 1998, the first day suddenly the energy supply dropped because the Russians were angry with the Ukrainians, and Russian gas comes through the Ukraine. And we had a problem, and it took several days to solve that. It is clear that the dependency on Russian oil and gas is increasing instead of decreasing, contrary to the to the resolution of the Europeans initially, and they said we have to diversify. It is, and now I have to also to say what is surprising to all the Europeans is of course that former Chancellor Schröder is the head of the Rosneft, the largest oil company in the world, as former German Chancellor. So it is clear, and he's attacked by many people. Even his own former party is disassociating itself from Mr. Schröder, but he does it. So this is a problem, and the answer is always, well, you know, and we can confirm this. Basically, the Russians did not yet use energy as a weapon against Western Europe. And so we trust the Russian treaty abilities, that they have always been trustful. Once they make a treaty, they are trustful. But looking at the behavior now, you can definitely question if that will continue like this in the future. So, but at the same time, we know now we have the liquefied natural gas coming over. There are ports being built. So there is a way and there is also a will to diversify. And in particular, some Eastern European countries are really pushing for that.
So thank you for coming. You mentioned that there would be like an eventual goal to include all of Europe into the European Union. Would this mean that there would eventually be a European defense and security policy? Because right now, like NATO is known as European Army, but if more Eastern countries join NATO, then that would be seen as a threat by Russia. So yeah, would more additions of European Union members?
If I may add on to that, and what will it do to Austrian neutrality?
Yes.
The question was about European security and defense, common foreign security policy, maybe a common army. So Austrian neutrality, right? We had the Irish ambassador here last year, and there's a different form of neutrality there. Sweden has a very active one, Finland a very passive one, Switzerland passive also for very different reasons. So common foreign security in Europe, Austrian neutrality.
I start and you go on. Austrian neutrality has been established, as I mentioned, in 1955, and then we became a member of the United Nations. We later became a member of the European Union. Now the relevance of neutrality in legal terms, but also in political terms, has diminished dramatically. It has become, I would say, almost irrelevant. But it's still there. It is in our constitution, and it forbids us to join NATO because explicitly it is said in the law that Austria must not join a military alliance. NATO, no doubt, is a military alliance. What if the European Union develops a defense union in the proper sense? In the future, perhaps a European army or joint striking force may emerge. That will not happen very soon. That will not be for tomorrow. But if that ever happens, I think Austria can throw neutrality in the dustbin of history altogether.
I should maybe add, there was a period around the year 2000, there was a public start of a public discussion if Austria should join NATO. But it didn't go very far because the population was told by the politicians for the last 50 years that neutrality saved them, which is of course nonsense. It's not neutrality that saved the Austrians, but it's the balance of power between East and West. But it's so ingrained in the population so that if we make a change of law, we would not get a majority in the parliament yet. It might change, but so far we, as Franz said, neutrality is devoid of its basic things. It is really the minimum what that is written in the law. We are not extending it, we are not active neutral, but we are just following the law by the letter.
If I may come in again on neutrality, it's my pet horse. Why are people in Austria against NATO? Why is the idea of Austria becoming a member of the Atlantic Alliance so unpopular? I think recently there were two developments which came into play. In 2001, when the 2001 it was, the attacks against World Trade Center, as a reaction, the war against the Taliban started. There was a NATO involvement in Afghanistan, and a couple of years later, the second Iraq war started, also with the coalition of the willing, involving NATO countries, and the majority of the people in Austria, they felt, oh, thanks God, we are neutral, we don't have to send our boys to Afghanistan, we don't have to fight in Iraq. So these wars were extremely unpopular. At the same time, there is also an ideological element. For the Social Democratic Party and for the leftist, left-leaning people in Austria, NATO is considered as a military alliance run by the United States. It is not seen as a peace organization, but as an instrument in the hands of the US as the Western superpower. And they have a reluctance also on, they see this also from a moral perspective. Yeah? NATO is bad, European Union is perhaps good. So this is the ideological component. And if there were a referendum tomorrow on whether or not Austria should join NATO, I'm 100% sure a large majority would go against NATO membership. That's something every politician in Austria knows, and nobody would call into question now in the political arena that Austria should no longer be neutral. So neutrality is like a taboo, although the contents has been hollowed out and is devoid of any meaning for me. As I always say, perhaps in a bit provocative way in the book.
Maybe to fill in the non-Austrian perspective of strong, neutral European member states. In Sweden, and especially in Finland, the discussion has again been opened up, and it's essentially a function of the distance to the bear. They reasserted Russia, right? And of course the Baltic countries are afraid they might do something similar to them that they did to Ukraine, because in Estonia and Latvia the population 30% is ethnically Russians. And with this kind of neighbor, Finland has been thinking about giving up their neutrality. Even Sweden had a debate. The Swedish debate is now over. So neutrality, there is no atheist in the foxhole, as they say, and sometimes it depends on the circumstances, the external circumstances. And Austria is an island away from Russia.
And the Swedes cooperate with NATO rather heavily, without still being neutral, but the cooperation is quite extensive.
Austria has a very long history with the Ottoman Empire, now Turkey, if you will. And Turkey is increasingly dominated by an authoritarian government. Is that having any impact on the Balkans, on Russia, and ultimately on Austrian politics?
It has a very big impact indeed. First, we have a rather strong Turkish population of Turkish origin, the first thing. And there is some interference by the Turkish authorities, in particular by Mr. Erdogan's party, to, for instance, to vote for his change of constitution when it took place. We have some indications or maybe proof that Turkish sent imams are preaching against integration in Austria, in Austrian schools, where they have Turkish religion, because they are allowed to have Turkish religion classes. So this was papered over by the parties in power until maybe 2 years ago. And then the present foreign minister clearly addressed the problem and said this cannot go on like this. And we did not allow Mr. Erdogan to speak in Austria. And we are checking now all the kindergartens and the schools if they are acting according to the Austrian constitution. So since Mr. Kurz, our foreign minister and leader of the Conservative Party, started to speak out, his popularity increased. So there was obviously a problem that was not addressed before. We have a problem with Turkey. For instance, Turkey blocked. I have to say, Austria is not a member of NATO, but we are participating in Partnership for Peace. And that means that we have some actions together with NATO, we have formation of officers and so on. And Turkey tried to block some cooperations of Austria with NATO in certain areas. And they did it, but I think it's on the way of being solved now. But so there is some problem with that. And the irony of the whole thing is, of course, that each Austrian or Viennese child knows that the Turks tried to invade Austria in 1529 and in 1683 and were repelled successfully by the Austrians, parenthesis, with the help of the Poles, the Ukrainians and who else, but still. And now these poor kids of Turkish immigrants have to learn the Turks invaded Austria in 1529. So of course this is not so easy for them to accept. But the fact is, and this is really serious, that you have a lot of interference in Germany, even more than in Austria, and that Turkey now has imprisoned about 15 German journalists, some of them with double nationality, and the impression is that Erdogan is keeping them to have an exchange for some Turks who are in German prisons and who are, Mr. Erdogan says, part of the Gülen party, which he accuses of being responsible for the coup 2 years ago, and he wants to exchange them against these journalists. One was just participating in a meeting of the, what was it, of an international an NGO, and they Amnesty International, and they imprisoned him. I mean, this is not 1920, but this is the year 2017 in Europe, or in a NATO country. So this is a serious matter, I think.
If I may, still on Turkey, our foreign minister is on record that the negotiations on the application of Turkey to become a member of the European Union should be stopped, should be suspended. He was in a minority when he proposed that in the midst of his colleagues of the European Union. Even the German Foreign Minister Gabriel spoke against stopping the process of negotiations. And funny enough, before the German Bundestag elections, I watched on German television, ZDF, a debate between Angela Merkel and her opponent Martin Schulz, in which a couple of days before the elections, all of a sudden, Schulz declared that he is in favor of stopping the membership negotiations. And that was, of course, in view of the elections.
Maybe I can add to that question one more element. It seems like we are living in an era of rising political strongmen, whether it's Putin or Erdogan or even Mr. Trump, who at least expressed a liking for political style of these people. And at least Putin and Trump are on record to be against European integration. And Trump supported the Brexit referendum, whereas of course Obama was on the other side. There, you could say, the extremes meet, and European integration and the classical European politicians are usually the ones that negotiate and cooperate and are not the ones with the big mouthpieces, right? The question is if this culture of cooperation might have actually bred a populism that goes against it. And I'm saying this because Austria has been well known as the country of popots, right, where you have a red and a black and a left and a right main People's Party, and they enter grand coalitions, and careers in public service or elsewhere might depend on the party book you carry, and you know, one job goes to the right, one to the left, to the black, to the reds. And this, of course, in the perception of many Joe the Plumbers, right, normal or lower middle class Austrians, might have led to a rejection of this kind of cooperative, negotiated, we will work it out, maybe behind closed doors kind of politics, feeding the protest movements that we see in the Freedom Party and in other parties throughout Europe. So is there a connection between the Trump, Putin, Erdogan kind of strongman politics and the kind of protest movements against the negotiated, multi-level, coziness, diplomatic style of politics inside the European Union, in some of its member states?
So I read an article by Ben Bernanke in which he described
Germany's large or high productivity and large trade surplus is a big problem. Do you think that a lot of Austrians agree?
The trade surplus. Oh yeah, well,
Yes, I know that. I'm always a bit angry about the trade surplus. The relation between a country with another country is not only trade surplus; it's also a question of the services surpluses. You know, and if you only pick up one part of the relationship and you say the trade surplus is here, what about the services? The services is, for instance, the United States has a services surplus with most of the countries in the world because of Google, Amazon, and so on and so forth. So you have to look at the whole picture, and that makes me a bit angry if you pick up certain things. This is the first thing. The second thing is, of course, I mean, trade is a question of division of labor. You're producing something that somebody else wants. Why should I not sell something if the Americans want German cars? I don't see that. By the way, the Mercedes has a plant in Alabama and the BMW has a plant here. So I think this whole discussion is really rather primitive because it is a cheap point without going into the details. I mean, you can always pretend this is like this, but if you look in the whole picture, it might look different. And this, for me, it is not serious, you know. Third thing, a trade balance can change with the value of the euro as, let's say, balance between the United States and the Europeans, not only Germany, because not only Germany, but if the euro goes down, we export more to the United States. If the dollar goes down, the Americans export more to the Europeans. It is too simplistic to say there is a trade deficit, we have to do something, without thinking that nowadays, if you produce a car, let's put an example of a car, you have components coming from Asia, you have components coming from Mexico, you have components coming from the United States, you produce it maybe in the United States, or you assemble it in Egypt or in somewhere in the East. The things are more complex than certain people understand.
We have more questions from the audience. Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentations. Excellent. I shall report them back to your colleagues, by the way. A couple of just smaller details. How are you integrating the 90,000? How successfully? We know how much of a struggle it's been in Germany. We talk about Bruno Kreisky. Can you tell me a little bit about Fiegel in 1945, 46, and his negotiations with the Russians? Be intriguing. And how is it that Austria somehow manages to succeed through all these crises? Italy has a crisis, Spain has a crisis now, we have Brexit going on, we have all these different, Greece of course, yet somehow this little island seems to glide along perfectly well. So there we are, 3 questions.
I start with Fiegel. I started my little presentation with the year 1945. And in the year 1945, Leopold Fiegel was the Chancellor of Austria right after the war. And I quote what he said in his Christmas address on a broadcast on radio. There wasn't any television at that time in Austria, and he said in his message to his fellow Austrian citizens, "There is nothing I can offer you for Christmas. I cannot give you any candles for the Christmas tree in case you should have one. I don't have any Christmas gifts for you, not a piece of bread, no charcoal for heating, no glass for repairing the broken windows. We don't have anything. I can only ask you, please have faith in Austria. This was a man of vision who, at the most terrible moment in our Austrian history, still kept the faith and kept the flame alive. And I think nowadays we are missing leadership of this kind in the European context, also in Austria. We don't have many leaders of this caliber like Bruno Kreisky and Leopold Fiegel. It is a different type of politicians who are at work now. I hate to say.
How did he negotiate with the Russians successfully?
Fiegel was very good in public relations, and he established a kind of friendship. Friendship is perhaps too much, but a very good working relationship with the Russian leaders, with Molotov, and also with the Soviet occupation officials in Vienna. And I think what the Austrians always were good at, they understood the psychology of Eastern Europe perhaps better than the Americans or other diplomats. Of course, the chemistry is not sufficient to explain the success of the negotiations on the state treaty, but it helped. It was like an oil to make it easier to negotiate with the Russians. So I think in international politics, psychology plays a great role. And this was also, I was told, the asset of Chancellor Kohl when he negotiated with Gorbachev about the German reunification. He was perhaps able to establish a kind of business-like, honest relationship with Gorbachev, which helped him to build trust and mutual understanding, and that was certainly important. Would you agree?
Absolutely. But I don't know if I would agree with the plain sailing, Austria being the epitome of a plain sailing little island, Alpine Republic, and I think Professor Prosl will probably fill in that gap.
Well, let me just answer the question of the integration of the Bosnians. The Bosnians, first you should not forget that Bosnia-Herzegovina was part of the Austrian Empire since 1878 until 1918, so 40 years. And we left a positive remembrance to them, so they like us and we like them. I myself, I have several projects in Bosnia, cultural projects that we are trying to help them to get books to public, to have translations, and helping the Academy of Science and so on and so forth. So that's a good thing. The second thing is these 90,000 who came were Muslims, but they have a European Muslim, European faith, meaning that they accept that there is a constitution and that religion and the state are separate. And religion is something that you practice, but it does not go further on, and that there is not the religion and the state is one. This they accept. We have an Islam law in Austria since 1912. We just modernized it, but we took it over from the monarchy basically. And we had Muslim soldiers in the Austrian army. By the way, the 2nd Herzegovinian regiment was a very appreciated and very brave regiment in the Austrian-Hungarian army. This is the second. Third, we are supporting the Muslims in being able to express their religious belief. We have made a conference of the imams, as long as they teach in German and that they accept also the Austrian values, in particular the Austrian constitution. And the organization where I'm the president, we made many years ago already a conference where we invited the highest representative of Islam in Bosnia to Austria, Islam in Europe. And 2 years ago we have made another conference how we can show them how we deal with religion in Austria, because we have many faiths, of course. We have the Catholic, the Protestants, we have the Orthodox, so, and how we see that the Islam in Austria, so that they see how they can promote, because we are interested in promoting an autochthonous European Islam. Islam has been on the Balkans for the last 500 years, and we didn't have any problems, you know. So we hope that maybe with this attitude, Islam is like any other religion, and it doesn't have to always have the connotation of political Islam and terrorists and so on and so forth. So we hope that this will work out, and that's a bit our objective, and it works out so far quite well. Now, it is not true that we do not have any problems. We have enough problems in Austria too, but there's this famous saying, we have always, whatever we say, the situation is hopeless but never serious in Austria. But we are 8 million people, so the political need knows each other, you know. And if you have, as what Franz said, if you have good leadership, people who have you can trust, then you can also solve the problems. The problem is, and therefore I'm so shocked by this dirty campaigning that we had in the last 2 months, then it's over, you know, that we have to regain the trust, and the politicians have to regain the trust of the population. This exchange somehow is not working too well now. And you have the same situation, of course, in the United States and in many other countries too. The question is, democracy is, as I said at the beginning, not only winning elections, also dealing with the people, involving the people, and the people have to be involved. We have to fight for democracy every day.
On that note, we have a final question, or time's up, or penultimate question. If that makes you less scared. Okay, the doors have been opened. We are probably being led out. So, The Sound of Music says, I have not seen that movie before I came here. I had to watch it to understand the American images of Austria. Maybe you're kind of the same way. I thank you very much for enlightening us and for giving us your sound. I noticed one interesting difference. The ambassadors talked about us when they talk about Austrian history, saying Bosnia-Herzegovina belonged to us from 1878 to whatever. Of course, the German would never say that. In our schools, the German government, the Germans, you don't identify as a, you don't have this collective us. The Americans have the same, right? We did this or that. Modern Germans don't have that. So that seems to be an interesting thing. So maybe it's a generational one, I don't know. Thank you very much. Yes?
Just to finish with a joke, an anecdote, because it refers to the us. When Otto of Habsburg, the heir to the throne, the last member of the ruling family, visited his family in Hungary, his son watched on television a soccer game between Austria and Hungary. He asked, against whom are we playing? This is us.
Against ourselves. Excellent. Thank you very much.